Now today we are going to start reading one of the great books of all of Western civilization. And we're going to spend a couple of weeks doing it, which isn't enough time, but it will at least give you a first run through it. And when you look at Plato's Republic, I think the first thing that you'll understand is that it's not strictly a work on politics, though it has the title, The Republic. All in one book, you've got a theory of ethics, of politics, of economics, of psychology, of education, of religion, and most importantly of all, of philosophy. And from this book, all of those fields have been influenced during the millennia that followed. It's not even really clear that this book has got much to do with politics. Plato may be using the study of government, the study of the state, as a metaphor for truth and for human understanding and the human moral sensitivity. Because really, after all, though the subject of the book is justice, which we think of as a political word, remember the Greek word that is being discussed throughout this book is not justice but dike. It is an inquiry into the nature of dike, that most fundamental of all Greek values, which means balance, proportion, harmony, justice, all sorts of things of that general kind. And so we're looking at an examination of a value that expresses itself in morality and everything else. And this is really a study in the Greek mind, trying to understand the Greek mind. Now, during the course of these next three lectures actually, I'm going to go through the argument pretty much step by step, picking out what I think are some of the crucial turning points, the points on which you have to make up your mind. Because in a way, this is an argument. This is the laying out of a position about the nature of reality and about what follows from the nature of reality insofar as it concerns human conduct. And it's one that's going to influence your thinking in various ways, but it's a very radical point of view. In fact, the fame of Plato is not really that he represents our common sense at all, because he doesn't, or that he's represented the common sense of any era. Plato has never been accepted as the official philosopher of any time. Plato has always been the countervailing force, the underground philosopher, the philosopher that causes us to think differently about what we take to be common sense. And not just in our age, but in all ages, he's pretty much played that role. So the question that you're going to have to ask yourself as we go along is, how far do you accept this argument? And when you do not accept it, when do you reject it, and why do you reject it? What reasons do you give? Now, the way we'll proceed is that today we'll pretty much work through the way the Republic is written, from the beginning through the creation of the ideal state, the state of the guardians. And then next time, which really runs in our edition of the book from pages 1 to 178, and then next time we'll just focus in on the allegory of the cave, which runs from 179 to 235. Now, those of you who are listening at home on the radio might want to follow along with our reading of Plato's Republic. This is a book that you can get, I'm sure, from your local library. And as I say, during our first session, we'll be working through the argument all the way to the end of the creation of Plato's ideal constitution, and then next time through what will be called in any edition of the book, the allegory of the cave. Now, let's talk a bit about Plato and Socrates, because as you've already discovered, though this book is written by Plato, Socrates does all the talking, and he is the main protagonist. Now, Socrates was Plato's teacher. And we don't really know today whether whether Plato was actually recalling or trying to record things that Socrates actually said, or whether he was dramatizing the Socratic method. We do know that he meant this to honor his teacher. We don't know how much then, and we never will know, how much of this is Plato's thought, how much of it is Socrates' thought, because the two are mixed together. The method, we believe, is Socrates' method, and a lot of it is his philosophy. But some of the political overtones are Plato's. Let me just say a word about the era in which this was written. We talked about the golden age of Greece, when Athens felt this tremendous sense of creativity and pride. And we associate this literature, Plato and Aristotle, with the golden age of Greece, but really it comes after the decline of Athens. Because in the golden age, the golden age came to a period of what we might call ebullient or almost jingoistic nationalism. Athens, feeling its power, feeling its success in throwing back the Persians, feeling its creativity, became in its most democratic period an expansionist power. It set up colonies, it tried to lead the Peloponnesian Wars and a number of wars, and finally, very much like the United States perhaps, moving between the era of, let us say, the Second World War and Vietnam, it overextended itself, and at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, say about 404 BC, it began to suffer military reverse after military reverse. Its armies, its navies were defeated at sea. The country became quarrelsome, internally doubtful, skeptical of the expansionist democratic currents that had led it to this kind of a conclusion, and eventually its democratic constitution was replaced by a much more oligarchical rule. Some called it a tyrannical rule. Well, there was a period, the period of the 30 tyrants, that then succeeded upon the democratic constitution about 400 BC. And this was replaced by little junta after junta, small dictatorial group after small dictatorial group, until about 399, 397 BC, when in fact the democratic constitution was restored. Now, Plato and Socrates apparently has had many misgivings about democratic Athens in the Golden Age. And both of them had more or less supported the regime of the 30 tyrants on the following grounds. They felt that democratic Athens had become too much a government of popular opinion rather than a government of law. That the courts were just proceeding whimsically to apply law any way they wanted to do, that the country was moving from one overseas expedition to another, very much at the whim of the strongest voice and the demands and the expectations of the masses. They were, even though masses in this case only connotes 30,000 people, the middle class seemed to be seeking things that the country could not do and ruling in what they felt was an inconsistent, arbitrary, and unlawful way. One day the law would be this, the next day the law would be that. The courts did not apply the law consistently from one case to another. Rather, they decided on the whim of the moment. And for this reason, Plato and Socrates had grave doubts about the democratic regime. Now, when the democratic constitution was restored, in fact, the leaders of that administration sought out Socrates and put him on trial on the grounds both that he had corrupted the youth, had been asking embarrassing questions, had questioned the gods of the country. This is a popular movement of the people, movement that felt Socrates was unpatriotic for doing these things, and because of his collaboration with the regime of the 30 tyrants. And in the famous trial of Socrates, which appeared before a court of some 500 people, the question was asked whether he had in fact been a traitor to the country. And the decision of the court was that he indeed had. Now, the prosecution in the case asked that Socrates be put to death. The defense asked that he be let off with a small fine. The court was a very divided opinion as to what to do. And they really hoped that Socrates would choose exile because it would be very embarrassing to put him to death. Now, what succeeded from that is a scene that's been recorded in all of Western history, which is that Socrates in prison, awaiting execution, the court has passed judgment on him, is in fact given the opportunity to escape, to go into exile. And his friends and the accomplices of the regime give him ample opportunity to choose exactly that course and thus to get away. And in a long series of deliberations, Socrates reflects on the reasons he will not choose exile over death. And they have to do with his particular understanding of the law and of the polis. And here we see most evidently this peculiarly Greek sense that politics is the center of the master science, as Aristotle will later put it, and the center of all human concerns. Because for Socrates, to be outside of the polis was not to be capable of life at all. Living in the polis creates life. It gives person a personality, it gives you your character, it gives you your morality, it gives you your law. In this sense, politics creates culture. And to live outside the polis is something that a person can't do. Now, if one is a citizen and has determined and is morally committed to uphold the laws, you can't do that just at your own convenience. And so when the time comes when you are given a chance to disobey the law, it would be inconsistent and immoral to take that opportunity. So Socrates chooses not to go into exile. He chooses the route of his own death, in a sense, to make the case, in effect, that consistency with one's moral commitment to the law is not a matter of convenience, but must be something that one endorses throughout and consistently throughout life, and that one just breaks faith with reality, breaks faith with the nature and the order of the universe in doing otherwise. Now, Socrates plays a particular role in the Greek philosophy that we've talked about so far. He is one of those who quest after that which is real and permanent behind appearances, and so he belongs to the legacy of Greek science. But in a way, he breaks from the tradition of Greek science, because Greek science thought that the most important thing to look for was what was real about the material universe, in what we would today call the realm of the natural and physical sciences. So those who sought the basic element of matter were going one way. Now, Socrates felt, and here he was really quite closely allied with his antagonists, the sophists, that the real crux of the question lay not in what was real about matter, but what was real about the human mind. You recall, the sophists had argued that what we thought was real about matter or the universe or the world did depend on the theories we created. And since they had come to the conclusion that all truth was a product of the human mind, and that we could only know truth insofar as the human mind reflected reality. But Socrates' position was a little bit different, in that he felt that truth already existed in the human mind. We were just not groping to comprehend things that the idea of mathematical form, the image by which we measured all things, the form that gave us our sense for what objects were, was already latent in the mind. And then that one brought this out and exposed it through a process of inquiry. Hence, the Socratic dialogue or Socratic dialectic, this process of asking questions by which we clarify our very approximate thoughts, becomes his technique of knowledge. And it's a very crucial technique. It works tremendously. David Nixon, Alan French will try it on you from time to time. You may want to try it on each other. It gives you the chance, if you just keep asking why, just keep probing, eventually you'll find out that the thought behind your thought might have been very far from what you originally expected or what you thought in the first place. And Socrates, throughout the Republic, you see this ongoing scene, almost to the point of tedium, where Socrates keeps asking questions and people give their sometimes stupid answers. Finally, about halfway through, Socrates reduces them to utter boredom, and they just keep saying, yes, Socrates, over and over again. But the thing begins on a very promising note. Now, this method was Socrates' way of drawing out of the mind something that was already there, something that he was in search of. And this is the form behind the thing. And this idea that behind everything in the world, there is an ideal form, else we could not understand it, is very essential to the whole Platonic notion of truth. In fact, it was the central Platonic teaching. So that things are not just what we see them to be. The things of this world are imperfect realizations of something that's more ideal. Now, the way we usually teach this is to say, all right, to see a horse out there in the pasture and to recognize that it is a horse. I mean, how did you know it's a horse? Why didn't you call it an albatross? Why didn't you call it a window frame? You know, why didn't you call it Brother George or something like that? Why did you call it a horse? Well, for you to see it as a horse, you would have to already have in your mind, so the argument goes, an image of a horse. Yea, an ideal of a horse, the very idea of a perfect horse. And when you look at that horse, you say, well, that's a good horse or a bad horse. Or that's not quite the same horse as the horse I saw the other day. And so you begin to realize that the horses that you see in the world are imperfect approximations of some ideal. Now, in the Platonic sense of things, everything we recognize as a distinct idea or a distinct object has behind it that eternal and immutable form. We can talk about horses. We can talk about the ideal table. But now let's get, but talking about more serious things, we can talk about the ideal person. Again, when you use the word a human being, and you look at one of your friends and you say, that's a human being, or you look at yourself, and I say, well, is that a perfect human being? You'd say, well, not really. Now, how did you know to do that? How is it possible? And where is this human being, this model by which you're measuring other humans and saying, no, if I'm not really perfect. I wish I had this right and this right and this right with me. And even if that was all right, I wouldn't still be perfect. Or how about these other characteristics of your friend? And you say, no, those aren't quite what I mean. Is that person that, I say to you now, is this person that you've just met, is that what you really mean by being truly human? And you'd say, no, that's an example of a human being, but it's not what I mean by truly human. Now, how'd you do that, is the question. Where did you get this idea of a perfect human being? Was it something you read in a book? I rather doubt it. Is it, you'd have to show me the book, and I doubt that you could think of it. Well, the Platonic idea is that that model, that image, is in the mind, and that's what enables you to think about not only what distinguishes a human being from other species, but enables you to make gradations, comparisons, to think about the arete, the excellence of being human, the virtue of being human. And you create a sense of arete, or virtue, by measuring the ideal that is in your mind against the person. Well, we can do the same thing with ideas. You say, gee, that's a beautiful sunset. Now, how'd you do that? How is that possible for you to say, have you ever seen an ugly sunset? But what do you mean by beautiful? Against what are you comparing it? Unless the idea of, now this gets harder, unless the idea of beauty itself is already in your mind. How would you know it was beautiful? How would you distinguish the beauty of a sunset from the beauty of the back wall of a handball court? Unless you were capable of some kind of discrimination between those things that had to do with some ideal type. Or take the word justice. Now, we've already explored that in one little example. Before you have a theory of justice, before you can say rationally what's just and unjust, you have what Edmund Kahn used to call a sense of injustice. You may not know what justice is, but I think you know what injustice is, that which doesn't make the form, that which doesn't meet the standard. As I said before, if I did something terribly arbitrary, like assigning this half of the class a paper and that class not, and you asked me why, and I said, well, these people don't look as good as the other people. Something's wrong there. You'd feel very uncomfortable at that idea, and you'd call it unfair, even before you had a theory of what unfairness is. Now, once again, how did you do that? How did you know that was unfair? Nobody has taught you a complete theory of justice. You haven't learned it from your culture. This is something the Platonists argue that comes from within. So the whole Socratic dialogue is at the one level meant to bring out this sense for the form, this sense of clarity that's already in the mind, one. And the whole of the Republic is an inquiry into the form of justice. So let's see how it begins and take it step by step through its various stages. Now, as you begin reading it, you see what's happening. We're at a party. It's one of those late night bull sessions that happened in Athens among the leisured class. We are going to debate philosophy. We've come away from a festival. If you want a Wisconsin equivalent, what we're doing is going to the country tavern, for a few beers, and we're going to sit down, we're going to have a good talk. And it'll work out about the same way. And really, it's not such a distant analogy if you know Wisconsin country taverns, because you can have some pretty good talks there. The only thing that's missing is Socrates, some of the time, not all of the time. But it depends on the country taverns you hang out in. Okay, so now let's just kind of think about this. This is the scene, this is the setting, and you can just feel in the beginning of the book that kind of fascination. And we're going to sit down for one of the longest bull sessions in recorded history. By the time 280 pages go by and we have discussed all of knowledge, it must be 4 or 5 days later, and you can just tell how weary people are getting by the end of the conversation. Socrates keeps picking up, as you notice, toward the end. He gets to say everything at the beginning. The other folks are getting their innings in, and as I say, about 4 o'clock in the morning of the third day after this thing begins, you can just hear them say, "Yes, Socrates, will you please shut up, Socrates?" But not Socrates. He just keeps right on going there until he reaches the end of the book or the end of your patience, whichever comes first. But it starts in kind of a high note, and they begin talking about the question, what is justice? Just, kind of thing you'd pick up in the afternoon. And various people come forward, and their definitions of justice may not strike you as important at the beginning, but they are reflections of the sort of thing that the man on the street or in the country tavern would say. For example, the first person to offer a definition of justice is Cephalus. And he comes up and says, "Okay, I'll give you a definition. I'll start this thing going. Justice means telling the truth and keeping your promises." Now that sounds pretty superficial to you, I suppose, at first glance, because you're already ready for philosophy. When you think about that, that's pretty profound. We can condense a lot of morality into those two propositions, telling the truth and keeping your promises. The whole basis of contract law is essentially based on that, which is the binding cement of our society. And if you say, what is morality? In essence, what should a good person do? To tell the truth, to keep your promises, not to deceive people, not to try to cheat them, not to try to harm them, is really the basis of a businessman's ethic. And it's the basis of any commercial civilization. And it's also the basis of any society that rests on the premise that the real legitimate relations between people are voluntary and contractual ones. So if we don't deceive each other, and if we do what others expect them to do in terms of the contracts we've made, so classic liberalism would tell us, we have perhaps the essential moral foundations for a good society. In our society, we might argue, for example, that if you didn't break the laws that you've, in effect, agreed to through democratic process, that's promise keeping. If you have kept your part of the bargain in commercial transactions, that's promise keeping. If you did not intend to deceive others or to cheat them, that's truth telling. That we could run a pretty workable, viable social order. The classic liberal of the Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan variety might say that this is indeed the essence of morality. Now, why does Socrates find it inadequate? Well, he begins to question Cephalus, and he says, well, are there not some occasions where telling truth is wrong, where you'd simply call it wrong? For example, if somebody asked you, if one of your friends asked you, this isn't Cephalus's example, but sometimes we can try better ones here. Somebody asked you, tell you what you think about me. Tell you what you really think about me. Now, are you going to tell that person the whole truth? Are you really going to harm that person's ego? Are you really going to, in a sense, destroy their own sense of their own self-worth if you have some doubts about them by letting them in on everything you know? No. Something holds you back and tells you it would be wrong to tell them the whole truth. So the truth-telling in this sense does not constitute a sure or complete guide to morality. The same with keeping your promises. So Socrates uses the example of borrowing a weapon from somebody, and then the person goes kind of insane, and thinks that they might, you think that they might harm themselves if you gave it back, so you keep it. So you haven't kept your promise to return the weapon. Now, in both cases, I suppose you could say there's an overriding principle that you should not harm others, that really willfully, meaningfully, that overrides the principles of truth-telling and promise-keeping. But at this point, all that Socrates wants to drive home is really a more fundamental point, which is, wait a minute. If you can take a given rule, a rule that you can articulate, like tell the truth, keep your promises, and if you can, under questioning, say, well, gee, under these, you can say, well, I don't know now. You say, this may not be always true. It may be wrong. It may be unjust to tell the truth in some situations. Then two very important things follow. One, that you are measuring the standard itself against still a higher standard. There is something in your mind that is telling you how to test whether the rule itself that you have taken to be the rule to judge your actions is right or wrong. And the second thing is, you're no longer a cultural relativist if you buy this argument. That the only thing you know about morality, the only thing you know about law, the only thing you know about goodness and badness is what your culture has taught you. Because this rule, tell the truth, keep your promises, is an old rule in our culture, as it was in Greek culture. And in a way, you've all been carefully taught that since the cradle. And in a way, what Plato is suggesting is cultural relativism, the culture as the source of morality for its own convenience, for its own internal perfection and maintenance, that's not all there is to it. You, the individual, are capable of judging the rules of your culture because of the sense of justice within. So right here, you've got to ask yourself, am I going the rest of the way with Plato? Because right here, you can change your mind and say, now, wait a minute. But in fact, right here, only about 10 pages into the Republic, you've got a choice that you have to face up to this semester, which is either you're going to go along with Plato in this one, and Socrates, or you're going to go along with cultural anthropology, and you can't have it both ways. So either you're going to lie to your anthropology teacher, or you're going to lie to Socrates, but you cannot reconcile the two. I mean, either morality is the product of culture, in which case you cannot make judgments because of something else, or Plato's and Socrates are on the right track so far. So you're deciding between Socrates and Cephalus right from this very moment. Now, second move in the argument. If you've gone that far, and you're still willing to go along, and you're not willing to say, no, Cephalus has it right, what morality really means is simply what these rules that are handed down to us, and to ask what they really mean is a futile and an illogical undertaking. That the essence of morality is to do what our fathers taught us to do, to honor our traditional values. You can say that and not inquire into them. You can say this, and then you are not accepting the Socratic method of proceeding. Now, Polemachus follows the similar line in his second argument. He's the second person who gets up and proposes a theory of justice. And essentially what his conception of justice boils down to is, again, a rule, almost a cliche. To Jew, justice is to help your friends and harm your enemies. Now that sounds a little distant to our ears. It's a cliche, it's a bromide. It's very much, but it was a conventional saying in Athens. Just the same way if you asked somebody who really hadn't thought much about the matter what morality was, they'd say, well, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They would just sort of quote something that they'd heard was the essence of morality. And what Socrates is going to do with this saying is about what George Bernard Shaw did with the Golden Rule, which was to say, do not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The others may not have the same tastes, thereby destroying the whole idea of the Golden Rule. And in this sense, what Socrates is doing is challenging people to think deeply about what we might call conventional, inherited, traditional beliefs, to see if they really hold up under scrutiny. Now, he follows a number of lines in arguing this point. One of them is to simply say, well, Really, do we really mean that it's always good to help friends and harm enemies, or is that really just a morality for wartime? Does that cover all the branches of morality? Or is this really only applicable to a very special kind of situation, the nation in its foreign relations, basically? For example, he would say, would we say a doctor was good if he harmed his enemies? Would we say that a person, and besides, a person might mistake who is his enemy. Would we say it is good to harm an innocent person just because you thought that person was your enemy? Now here again, what Socrates is doing is saying, if you can see the point of those questions and say, well, there may be something wrong with the rule, I would not say it is good for a doctor to harm his enemies. You may be saying, I am measuring in my mind goodness and badness of rules themselves, rules that are supposed to give me a sense of goodness and badness, against something else, against an image of, or a sensitivity, if you want to use that word, to what justice is and what justice is not. Now, the third protagonist, Thrasymachus. Justice here becomes the interest of the stronger. And Thrasymachus argues that what we mean by, and he comes on, tough-minded, burly, absolutely on top of the situation. And he's going to argue that what we mean by justice can only be discerned, well, that justice doesn't exist. He knows what Socrates' game is, and he's going to tell you what justice is. Justice is the interest of the stronger party. What justice really turns out to be is what the people in charge want us to do. And we learn this, and it's almost a Marxist argument. Justice is what's in the interest of the ruling class. That's what it really boils down to. Don't give me all this stuff about good and bad, right and wrong. When we talk about the idea that private property is a good thing, what it really means in America is that we've been taught to respect private property, and the reason we've been taught to respect private property is that that serves the interest of the capitalist class. So really, when you talk about what we mean by right and wrong, good and bad, it's what is useful for those who rule us to have us believe. So that all morality is a rationalization. It's a kind of myth that's foisted upon us to keep us organized and manipulable by those who are in power. Now, it may not be the ruling class. It may be the majority. But it doesn't matter. The stronger element determines what justice is. And, and that's that. Now, a lot of you are tempted by this position. If you think about it long enough, you may work yourselves into believing it. What's Socrates' response to it? Well, it seems an evasion at first. He simply argues, well, what would happen? Is it not possible for the stronger element or the ruling class to mistake their interest? They might tell you, for example, that it was good to go to war and get you all whipped up in a patriotic fury to harm your enemies, and you might lose the war and they might be destroyed in the process. Now, would it be, if you really mean that justice is the interest of the stronger, then following the stronger when they mistake their interest would be a mistake, wouldn't it be? Well, Thrasymachus thinks about this and he begins to think, well, maybe I've got a little bit of a problem of a contradiction there. But what Socrates is after again is, wait a minute, if you can go that far, you once again can say the individual can measure, can judge the authenticity even of things that have been learned, that have been created of a whole mythology that's been created by a ruling class. For example, if you took the Thrasymachus position that justice is simply the will of the stronger, you might come to the conclusion that, well, justice means doing the job that your teacher or your employer told you to do. But if in the middle of the job you look up and say, now wait a minute, if I do this, the company's going to go bankrupt, what are you supposed to do? You've got your orders, you've been told what to do, you can go ahead and do it and the company's going to go bankrupt. Or you can say, now wait a minute, your object can't be that the company go bankrupt. You can make an independent judgment of the point and the purpose of the activity by yourself, apart from anything you've been taught. And if you do that, you're judging by a standard that is apart from what you've been taught or what has been willed by the stronger party. Now, all of these refutations of simple tests of justice lead Plato, or Socrates, to another consideration which is just absolutely crucial. And this is the one that I think the whole book turns on this point. If you get by this one, if Socrates can suck you in on this one, you've got to buy the whole rest of it, I think. If you can refute it, then maybe you can resist his argument. And that is the question of whether government is to be regarded as like a craft, like medicine or navigation or architecture. Now, here we're building to a notion of what political justice is. And as Socrates argues, the point of a craft is certainly not the advantage of the craftsman. We would not say ever in any language, any ordinary sensible conversation, that the whole point of medicine is to make doctors richer. Now, the doctors may look at it that way, but we would say that's a corruption of medicine. I mean, Victor Borge tells the story. I have an uncle. He's a doctor. He specializes in the diseases of the rich. And everybody laughs. Now, why do you laugh? Well, partly because it's a whole perversion of the point of medicine. We measure medicine by its purpose, which is to create health. And we know that its object isn't to further the fortunes of those who pursue it. Well, Socrates argues then, the same is true of any craft. The object of carpentry is, of course, to secure a living for the carpenter, but that's not its real point. Its real point is to build houses. The object of navigation is to sail ships from here to there. And so we can inquire about the point or the objective or the end of any craft and find out what its real function is. Now, that poses the question of what the end of an end. A craftsman, then, is one who knows the end of the trade and how to get there. Now, here we're discussing virtue, excellence, arete. To be a skilled navigator is to know the excellence or the virtue inherent in navigation. To be a skilled doctor is to know the excellence, the virtue, the arete inherent in medicine. It's not to know how to make money. It's not to know how to expand its practice. It's how to heal people, for goodness sake. So this poses the question, is government a craft? And if it is, what is its end? What is its excellence? What is its virtue? But there's more to this than meets the eye, isn't there? Because if we say that government is like a craft, then we're saying there's some who are going to be good at it and others who are not. And that means that those who are naturally fitted to govern should govern, and not just anybody. The same way you wouldn't want medical practice to be done by the lottery system, the way we select juries. Who's going to treat your broken back? We'll take the first 10 names out of the phone book and see who's available. You want it done that way? Okay, maybe so. I don't know. I don't think so. Take airline piloting. Should we do that by lot? Take the 20th passenger flies the plane. No, I don't think you want to do that way. Now, the argument you see here is that democracy starts with the assumption that all are equally fitted to rule. That's what Pericles had in mind. Democracy starts with the assumption that each person's vote counts the same as every other person's. And what Plato is suggesting is possibly democracy rests on a false assumption. Everything depends on whether you accept the analogy between other crafts and government. Because if there is a skill, if there is an excellence, if there is a virtue to governing, then those who govern should have that virtue and none other. Now this theme, of course, leads, well, there's another question in here. There's a dialogue with Glaucon. Suddenly somebody jumps into the conversation and at this point tries to turn the tables on Socrates, says, you've been asking all the questions, let me ask you a question. Why is justice itself a good thing? Most people don't really want justice. They really just want the reputation that comes with justice. They don't want to be good, they want to appear to be good. You think about, and he says, now you've got to prove to me that it is really good to pursue goodness in and of itself and for itself. And Glaucon's argument is, I'm not persuaded of that. I'm persuaded I can be a very happy person if I pretend to be good. If I do the nice thing, if I'm nice to my teachers, if I study carefully in school, if I do all these things, not because they're good, but simply because I know I'll get a good job and then I can move to suburbia and live a yuppie lifestyle and restore an old house and drive a Mercedes-Benz if I do all those things. But that's really good. And don't ask me about, getting good grades in school because of the intrinsic joy of learning or anything like that. Come on now, that's not it. So prove to me that it's worth pursuing justice and not all these other things I'd really think most people want and that they would call good in and of themselves. Now, that puts the burden on Socrates to make his positive case. Enough asking questions, Socrates. The ball is now in your court. And he does this, he says, he's going to examine then justice, which he takes to be the aim of government. The skill, the art of government is creating decay, creating harmony, proportion, balance in the world. And he's going to examine that at two levels, he suggests. One, we can understand what justice is in itself as a moral question, what the good life is, what the good for the individual is, by looking at it this way. But we can also understand political judgment, justice, because they're the same thing. They're one and the same thing. And the reason we can do this together is that essentially by blowing it up and talking about it in political terms, instead of in terms of the individual and morality, talking about politics instead of ethics, what we're doing is looking at justice in the large. The state and its nature provides us with a larger scale on which to view the question of what justice is itself. But also in that way, we will get to the question is, if we took seriously the proposition that governing is a craft, what kind of a state would we then create and describe as legitimate? And on this basis, Plato begins to describe his famous utopia, which, by the way, looks very much like the constitution of ancient Sparta. Now, the first proposition is an economic one, and is the foundation, incidentally, historically, of free enterprise economics, if you want to look at it that way, modern capitalist economics, which is that the proper foundation of the state is a division of labor, by which Socrates means that not everyone should do the same job, that it is appropriate for different people to do different things. You don't want Marx's utopia that we'll read about next semester, in which everybody does manual work and everybody does poetry and everybody does the variety of jobs. You want people to specialize. Now, why? Well, fundamentally, and here's the theory of human nature underlying Plato, people are different. People are not created equal. People are created with different excellences, different talents, different abilities. And it is adikia, it is unjust, to ask a superb carpenter to be a university professor or vice versa. It is unjust to ask somebody who's all thumbs to be an auto mechanic, and it's unjust to ask somebody who's tone deaf to be a musician. You want human occupations sorted out in terms of human abilities. Now, at this point, you say, yes, Socrates, of course. And so he goes on and describes the principle of an economy that's differentiated and in which society will only be well-governed and will only be harmonious and in balance if people are doing the things they're suited for. Now, this is not only an image of society, it's a standard of judgment. We can say that something's wrong with society if people are doing things that they're ill-suited for. And in a sense, we can always criticize an existing social order when people are doing things that they are not suited for. Now, from this it follows that there are many different kinds of trades, many different kinds of skills. But when we look at the skills of government, we are going to need some specialists themselves. And he speaks of specialists in war, soldiers who have certain kinds of virtues, and he discusses their virtues, the police, and the administration, and he talks about the different qualities, the different human qualities that would go into those skills. But as he goes along, he begins to say, but none of these really are the specialists in government itself. I mean, war is a subdivision of government. Carrying out administration, even justice, is in the sense of running a court, is a subdivision of administration. When we come to the rulers, when we come to those who are to make the laws, the supreme legislators, they've got to be someone else. They can't just be calling out the functions, they have to be creating justice. And so they are people who cannot simply be reflecting, notice, custom, tradition, what's been going on in society. They have to rise above it. So these, the guardian class, have to be set apart from birth and placed in a special education and a special system in society, a governing class that will then be prepared to carry out the craft of governing, to carry out the craft of administration. Now, since excellence at statecraft has to do with balance, harmony, and proportion, as you read, you find that the education of the guardians will be that of learning all those things that reflect justice in its various forms. They will learn architecture, they will learn art, they will learn music. Why? Because in all these ways you're reflecting different kinds of justice. So you have to go at learning this idea of justice indirectly. So the guardians are taught by seeing the manifestations of justice in all different parts and forms and ways and activities of life, because you can't just tell them what justice is. The forms cannot be taught directly. We see only its reflections, parts of it, in diverse human activities. We note that the life of the guardians must be communistic, communal. They do not have they are deprived of private property. They are deprived of family. They live together, and the reason for this, of course, is that they must be impartial and disinterested. They must follow the aims of statecraft. They must follow the aims of justice, which are not their own aims. Because just as medicine is corrupted if the doctor follows his own wishes or the wishes of his family rather than the wishes of his craft, so the state is corrupted if the governors follow the wishes of their family, their self-interests, are concerned with those things, rather than with the wishes of, rather than the pursuit of justice for its own sake. Very similar to the principle of Catholic celibacy, that the Catholic prelate should be free from all concern for anything but service to God. Well, there follow many other things, but as you look at this, toward the end, you begin to see what Plato's ideal society looks like. And your first impression, and the impression that has come down to us through all the years, is that this is a totalitarian state. Obviously, the guardians rule. They rule through administrative officers, police, warriors, who are picked for their skills. In effect, the position of everybody in society is assigned because the object is to create perfect harmony and justice. It is not Athenian democracy. It is Sparta in a certain sense. There is a ruling class on top. But if you agree to the idea that politics is like a craft, can you escape the conclusion that politics ought to be organized in this authoritarian or totalitarian fashion by those who know the craft of government? Now, last time we began to consider the way Plato, this very complicated book, The Republic, which covers so many subjects, and we're just focusing on some aspects of it, those that have to do with the logic of Plato, with the philosophy of Plato in relationship to his conception of politics. As we said at the beginning of the course, every great political theorist, well, all of us for that matter, start from an image of reality and work from there to a conception of ethics, politics, and economics. And Plato did this too, but he did this in an enormously subtle way. So let's review a little bit of the first part of his analysis and of his argument, and how he goes about constructing what seems to be, at first glance, his notion of an ideal state. Now, there are many things in this argument that you may take exception to. You may not like Plato's conception of eugenics, of racial purity. You certainly might not like his idea of women and their place in the world, of his family, of the family. You may not like his whole idea of education, but try to keep in mind the overall logic of what he's saying, not all the detail that he puts on it. And if you are going to take exception to it, see where you're going to take exception to it and why you're going to take exception to it. Now, in a way, we can propositionalize in about 5 or 6 propositions this first part of the argument. And maybe Plato and Socrates' first proposition would be, we could put like this. Society requires many different talents or virtues. And this comes from the Greek idea that there is an excellence to everything, an arete to everything, a virtue to everything. And these are not, all human activities are not one. Human activities are very diverse. And each human activity has its own virtue. Now let's call the practice of these virtues a craft. So society needs a variety of crafts. It needs farmers, it needs soldiers and administrators, it needs builders, it needs doctors, and it needs ship captains. And each craft has its peculiar excellence. We can talk of doing any one of these activities well or poorly in terms of a standard that is inherent in the activity itself. Hence, a good doctor is one who practices medicine, and we can ask what is the end or the goal or the virtue of medicine, and we can answer health, the health of the body. Or we can talk about architecture, and we can say what is the end of architecture, and we can say, well, function, structural integrity, harmony, and beauty in some sense. What is the end of being a ship captain or of navigation? Well, getting from here to there without accident, on time, efficiently, and directly. Now, in a way, even at this level, Plato is talking about this abstract idea of the forms, you notice, because every craft has its form. We measure, you know, if you asked, and doctors do this all the time, if you ask the question, what is health? Any definition you'd give would be pretty inadequate and arguable. And the medical profession has never settled on an absolute definition of health that all doctors were satisfied with and knew when they were meeting it. And yet we have a sense in our mind that we know the difference between health and illness. We know what it means to pursue good health and what it is for a doctor to try to work toward good health. And in this sense already, Plato is suggesting we're measuring a craft, we're measuring the performance of people in their work and in the world by standards that we cannot absolutely identify or put into words, but that must exist in our minds so that we can take the evaluative measure of these things, that we can say this is a good job or not such a good job. Now, in the idea of, this first postulate of Plato in the Republic, society needs a variety of talents, and a good society is one which operates on which seeks excellence, which seeks to have things done well. That we would not agree to a society in which, by intention, things were done poorly. And as I suggested last time, I don't think you'd be wildly happy about the idea that anybody who wanted to practice brain surgery just because it simply made them feel good to do so in a purely hedonistic way ought to be permitted to, or that a good society was one where everybody went around experimenting with everybody else's brains. And you'd think there was something wrong with that idea. And that to do something properly, according to the standard within it, at this point, Plato's trying to get you to agree to the proposition that that is a mark of a good society and a standard by which we should judge our economies and basically the economy and the social structure of society, and we will judge it by that standard he's suggesting to you. Now, here's this first value of Greek life: excellence, virtue, arete, and this is part of the system. Now, the second element in this, then, is that justice requires, first, that those who have a talent for a particular craft perform it, and this becomes the principle of division of labor. And then the second problem is to pull all these diverse talents together into a harmonious or a just whole. Farmers are farming, and they have to provide the cities, to provide the administrators and the businessmen with food, and the businessmen and food have to provide the markets, the commerce that gives life to the society, provides an excess for imports, that gives birth to law and administration and intellectual activities. It's the thing that we talk, I mean, it's just sort of the central proposition of economics, of any form of economy, that coordination, cooperation, trade and exchange, fitting the parts together becomes a crucial element. And for Plato, this represented the second virtue of a good society, what the Greeks called dike, harmony, balance, proportion, here expressed as a proposition of political economy, of the way society ought to be organized. Now, from this it follows that each craft should be performed according to its specialized aim, and that each craft should be, and that crafts should not mingle with one another. In other words, it wouldn't be a good idea for society to have all the people who are trained as good ship captains practicing architecture, or all the farmers doing the school teaching, or something of that kind. And here's the crucial point for modern thought, by the same token, a state that is ruled by the practitioners of one of these partial or incomplete or not total specialties would be unjust. It would be adikia. Now for this, the argument would be as follows. Physicians should not govern. Why? Because the aim of the state is not health. You know, you wouldn't say that just simply having a healthy society was the object of government, the object of the polis, the object of society in and of itself. It's one object, but it's not the object. And by the same token, soldiers should not rule the state, because the aim of the state is not war or even national defense. That's an aim of the state. It's an aim of society. But security alone isn't enough. It's not the total aim of society. And by the same token, businessmen should not rule the state, for the aim of the state is not profit, or you might say in more modern language, even economic growth. And this is an interesting idea, because I think very often we do evaluate government today in contemporary terms according to how well it performs its economic function. A good society is one that does not have recessions, that provides full employment, that provides economic growth, that makes people more prosperous. Now, Plato would say we've missed the point, that that is not the aim of government, it's an aim of government. And it's only a partial aim of government. Well, what is the aim of government then? And Plato would say the answer is really quite simple. It is the harmonious blending of those talents into a good society in which each craft, each part, each function that society needs to perform is performed with excellence by those who have the skill to perform it, and each one is in balance in relation to all the rest. None moves over into the other sphere. Physicians do not meddle in politics or try to run politics. And by the same token, politicians do not try to run medicine, and so on. And in this sense, if each craft was performed by those who were expert in it or excellent in it, then society would be itself inherently just. But this means, for Plato, that those who rule, those who govern, must also be specialists. Because he argues each person with his own talent is just a judge of the part. He or she is not a judge of the whole. We can make a lot of mistakes. I'm a professor, and I may tend to judge political events by how they contribute to the life of the mind. And that may not be a good idea, because the life of the mind isn't everything, isn't the only thing for society. And by the same token, a businessman shouldn't be the only judge of political affairs, or isn't even a very good one, because he keeps thinking about how the books balance, whether things are working out profitably, whether government spending too much money can't pay its debts. He's worried about deficits and taxes and things like that. And while that's an important aim, it's a biased aim. It's a partial aim. Each of the talents, each of the virtues we bring biases our judgment, and hence we can't really create justice in the state. So the rulers must be specialists in justice itself. And what they must do is to create a harmonious whole from the manifestations of justice that appear in all the different talents. So that, in a sense, every talent is part of universal justice. And I think you know that. I mean, you sense when you watch a really good carpenter, a really good automobile mechanic at work, that there is something in what they're doing that's like what they're doing that's a little like a symphony, or it's a little like a masterpiece of art. And you know it isn't just a craft. And when you watch somebody really running a business smoothly and efficiently and serving the consumer well, you get a sense for a harmony and a manifestation of something that's not unlike art, and it's not unlike science, and it's not unlike the skill of something like medicine. So in each art, in each craft, there is an internal sense of justice. But none of these is complete justice. Now, the ruler who understands justice by these manifestations appreciates all these other arts, but appreciates also how they fit together. So the guardians, in effect, must be able to get on top of the problem, as we say in modern society. They can't be so immersed in any one of these manifestations of justice that they are biased by it. They must look for the harmony of the whole, the completeness of the whole. And that requires a special education to guide them to this talent for harmonizing diverse specialties and toward impartiality. And when you then go on to read Plato's description of the education of the guardians and their lifestyle, you see what this requires. The knowledge of justice itself requires what we would call, I guess, in integrated liberal studies, a liberal arts education, an appreciation of goodness in a wide variety of fields. It's not a specialized education. It's picking up the best everywhere and seeing it all in relationship to one thing and another. So as you notice, the guardian studies physical education, he studies religion, he studies music, and in all of those things, what you're trying to do is to introduce the guardian class to the intimations of justice in a variety of forms. Now, you don't have to do that with a ship captain. You teach a ship captain navigation, it's rather pointless to teach the ship captain music, by Plato's standard. We might disagree with that in modern terms. And curiously, I suppose, even a program of liberal education like integrated liberal studies was intended as an education for leaders, and frankly, does follow a little bit of the old Platonic model in its design, in its conception, in what we're trying to do. There's a sense that we're, a very immodest sense, this is education for the guardians rather than for the specialists, even though I don't think we really believe that at this point in time. So that the education is one thing, the other is impartiality. The guardians have to be set apart from society, and you do this by the arrangements for communal living. No private wives, no private family, no private property, nothing that can bind your interests to anything other than the welfare, not of society, but the doing of justice itself. Important distinction there. The object of the guardian is not simply the good of society, not to do the will of the people, not to do what's best for Athens or America. The duty and the responsibility of the guardian is to justice. And through justice, he does his duty to his society, and by doing justice, he does his duty to society and to the people. Now, along the line, Plato introduces, the mood changes suddenly in this discussion, and Plato introduces another discussion which is called the myth of the metals. And this just pops out of the page at you, and you wonder what it's doing there. And he somehow loses this logical or descriptive sense and begins to create this fable, this fairy tale, this myth, how all people are divided into gold or silver or bronze. And this gets layered with folklore and legend and other very odd beliefs. And one wonders what that is doing in the middle of the argument for a while, until one realizes that what Plato is saying, I think, is that if you did set up such a state of the guardians, the people wouldn't accept it. Because the people, again, have their partial biases. The businessman thinks the government should be run by good businessmen, not these starry-eyed guardians. And the carpenter thinks, by golly, it's people who know how to make straight buildings, and all these guardians are going around making oval-shaped gardens, and that's a terrible thing to do. And so these people are going to resist the knowledge of the guardian because they have their specialized point of view. So you have to teach, so there's another educational function involved. You have to teach the people a noble lie. You have to teach them a belief system, a mythology. And remember, Athens at this point is still not too far distant from the age of Homer. There's a mixture of rationalism and religion, as America isn't so far away from mythological age. We too believe that our value system is founded on a mixture of religion and rationality. And so when you think of Plato's myth of the metals, in a way, all he's doing is saying the same thing an American might say, and saying, no matter how rational your government is, make sure it has a religious foundation. And if you ask the question, well, is that rational foundation science, is that religious foundation scientific? Is it rational? You might say no. And then some people, but not all, would say, but it's helpful. Because it teaches people to respect the law, it teaches people to obey the customs of the country, it teaches people values who might not understand the higher logic of the law. And if you can agree with that proposition, or if you've heard that said in the name of religion in America today, then you're understanding a little of what Plato meant by the myth of the metals. That you teach the people something other than the truth about the foundations of their society, because the people themselves don't know justice. And in the interest of creating a just society, then, you have to fabricate a myth or a tradition or an idea of that society that isn't quite true. Now, about this point, Plato and Socrates seem to complete what many people historically have taken as Plato's ideal state. And many of you have looked at it and just a shiver's gone down your spine and said, this is a totalitarian society. Plato is some kind of a fascist. What's going on here? Well, how has this come down to history as something so important and so lovely for us to admire? But at this point, right after the Utopia is completed, Socrates, Plato, informs us that we have not found out what justice is yet. Because the whole book, after all, is an inquiry into what justice is. And in a way, we haven't yet defined the ideal constitution. Because remember, even the guardians don't know what justice is. All that they know are the appearances of justice that are manifest in various arts, crafts, and human activities. Only, Plato says, the philosopher truly knows what justice is. And then, on page 177 of your book, after all of this, after 3 nights of talk, after 177 pages of your reading and trying to remember all of this, Plato asserts that we have neither found out what justice is or the good society is yet. Because he says, unless philosophers become kings, or those who are now called kings come to be instilled with a genuine desire for wisdom, unless political power and philosophy meet, there can be no help from our troubles. Well, where do we go from here? Now, this is a fascinating proposition. Who should rule? Not the guardians, not the specialists in justice. Philosophers should rule. Now, this idea, when you think of it, and your 20th century guys, is not a terribly attractive one, especially if you've met philosophers. Yeah, you think about it, I mean, I guess really, I think I'd rather be governed by the first dozen names out of the Madison phone book than the entire philosophy department of the University of Wisconsin. And I don't know quite what that means, but I think, again, it's one of these problems of translation where we begin to misunderstand Plato so entirely. Just as if you think about justice, without realizing the larger connotations for the Greek mind. If you think about that, that constant reflection of the word virtue, which sounds so prissy to you, without thinking that that word really means arete and excellence and the sense, the inner purpose or the end or the object of a craft or any human undertaking. We found there are a lot of places that you can understand these wonderful Victorian translations of Plato. And the other place, I think, is in this notion of a philosopher. Because we think of a philosopher as someone who specializes in theory, or if we want to be honest about it and generous about it, in rationality. You think of a philosopher as someone who is very rational about things, very logical. And in a way, if you read Plato the way we're beginning, we're tempted to read him, It almost sounds like he's saying government should be logical. Government should be rational. You know, you can almost substitute and say mathematicians should rule or logicians should rule. And somehow you're tempted by something here. Economists, heaven knows these days, are tempted by it, and others are tempted by it, which is a very modern view of what Plato meant. And this idea of philosophy, and this idea that wisdom should be rational in the sense of mathematical, sure, there's an underlying Pythagorean theme in everything we're talking about here, but this is a very modern conception and has nothing to do with the way the Greeks actually probably saw it. Because once again, to understand Plato's idea of a philosopher, we have to go back and understand his response to the Greek problem of illusion and reality, the doctrine of the forms that we discussed briefly last time. And his way of responding as dramatically as he did to this proposition, this question that the pre-Socratic philosophers put up and that changed the course of all Western inquiry. Everything we see around us could be illusion. It could be different. Everything we see around us is not necessary. What then is the reality behind appearances? And in answering that question, Plato is driving toward the conception of good government. Good government should be founded on reality, not illusion. And the whole work of the world should be. And in this way, he's also answering that timeless question that everybody's asked about society. What is the order of the universe? And then what follows from the order of the universe for the order of human and social affairs? We saw how the Mesopotamians answered that question, the Egyptians, the ancient Hebrews. We saw the attempts of others to answer it, how the Periclean age thought about that. And now we see Plato's very distinctive answer to it and what he means by the idea that the philosopher should rule. Well, once again, let's review his idea, the fundamental idea behind the Platonic forms. What we see, the world of appearance around us, the transitory world, that from the Greek point of view is just illusion, is always changing, is always in flux, and therefore is not permanent. These things are images, just images, that's all. If we look at something and we say, that's a square, for example, and then we look at it again and say, but that's not a very good square. It's not really an accurate square. A perfect square wouldn't be lopsided and have little jingles in it. But how do we know it's a square at all? How does something pop out of the world? Can you do this just for a moment? Can you sort of just close your eyes and kind of open them and think of what the world, or just kind of maybe just blur your eyes so that you can't see distinctive visions. If you're nearsighted, this is a real easy trick. And you cannot distinguish separate objects. Well, now if you open your eyes fully or put on your glasses and you see separate objects, you make distinctions. That's a person, that's a blouse, that's a chair. Well, why is that not a person, blouse, chair? You know, why don't all the three things go together? How do you take the particular cutout of reality that you do unless there's something telling you to identify person versus chair as the essential distinction that you're supposed to make? Now, over and over and over again, Socrates and Plato try to persuade you that ultimate reality has to be that way. It has to be founded on this idea in the mind. For us to even think of this thing, this object as a square, we have to have an idea of a square that exists previously in the mind. And furthermore, there's an idea of excellence. It's not just scientific. It's not just the way we identify things. It's also moral in a strange way, because we say good and bad about those things. We say that isn't a very good square, for example. So we evaluate by the form. To put it another way, all knowledge is a matter of comparison between an ideal and a reality, between the ideal and the things that appear to our senses, rather. Take a harder case, for example. What happens if I put the question to you, is this class a community? Now, we could go off and we could argue about that for an hour, and you'd say, no, I don't think it's a community. And we'd say, why not? Why isn't this class a community? And you'd say, well, we don't know each other. And I'd say, do any group of people who know each other, everybody knows their names, is that a community? And you'd say, well, I'll have to think about that for a moment. No, they have to have a common purpose. Any group that knows each other and has a common purpose is a community. Well, you're not quite sure, but each time a definition is tried, what are you doing? And you're trying to accept the definition. You're comparing that definition with what? With what? With the city of Madison? You're thinking, the city of Madison is indeed a community. I will compare this with it. With Rhinelander or Hayward, Wisconsin, where you grew up? No, I don't think so. That's not an ideal community. With Athens in the 4th century, with 100,000 slaves? No, that isn't your ideal of community. Where is this thing that you're comparing all these definitions of community with to make up your mind to the simple, everyday, obvious question, is this class a community? Now, if you can't show it to me, if it's not here in the physical world, where is it? And where did you read about it? And since you're not talking about community anymore, we're saying, how do you define community? It is a group of people who know each other and have a common purpose. And you say, well, I've got to think about that. I'm not quite sure that's still a sufficient definition of a community. How do you know it isn't sufficient yet? What is it you're still going to think about, for heaven's sake, if not Rhinelander or Athens or this class or the city of Madison or the New England town meeting or something of that kind? Okay, Plato's trying to tell you that's in your mind. There's an image of the community that you're working on as you give these abstract definitions. There's an image of the community right on down the line. Now, Plato says that we not only do this with words like community, words like horse, words like lamppost, but with values. We can ask the question, what is beauty? We can ask the question, what is justice? In just exactly the same way. And we are always comparing our ideas of justice with some image, some form that must exist in the mind. For there to be an unjust act, there must be a standard of comparison. And if I say, for example, giving the example we've used several times, take another example. I say, from now on, we're going to meet in discussion sections differently. All the men are going to be in one discussion section. All the men are going to be in separate discussion sections. We're going to put all the women in one discussion section because they're not worth much after all. And we'll just have one discussion section about 80 people for women, and then the men will meet in groups of 10. And I just can feel it, out there. That's unjust. I say, well, why is it unjust? And somebody will tell me, well, that's discrimination. And I'll say, what's wrong with discrimination? And you'll say, well, you're treating people arbitrarily. And I'm saying, now why is arbitrariness unjust? We discriminate in all kinds of ways between people, and we do it fairly arbitrarily. For example, we discriminate between the intelligent and the dumb. Not everybody got into the University of Wisconsin. If we can leave dumb people out, why can't we leave women out? What's the difference between discriminating on the grounds of intelligence and discriminating on the grounds of sex? They're both inborn traits you can't do anything about. Seems just as relevant to do it one way or another. And you're thinking, aren't you? You're beginning to worry a little bit about that proposition. And you're already wondering whether maybe our society, the learned value, everybody should have an equal opportunity to prove their talents. Well, wait a minute, you didn't deserve your talents. You didn't earn your talents. They were born in you, like being female or being black or being Oriental or being American Indian. So why should we treat smart people any differently than poor people? But we do in this society. You make a whole lot more money, get a whole lot more honor, get to go to nice places like the University of Wisconsin. Now already you're saying, wait a minute, maybe that is unfair, and it's not just a consistency test. Think about how you're doing it, what's going on. Is there maybe what standard are you comparing it against so that this argument makes any sense at all to you? Okay, now this is Plato. And Plato goes through and says, look, you've got 3 levels of knowledge that we're dealing with in everything. On the everyday level, we make judgments in terms of opinion, doxa, orthodoxy. And what we do is we trade ideas simply on the basis of cliches, like Cephalus and Polymachus and Thrasymachus' definitions of justice, or our own cliches. Sex discrimination, sex discrimination is bad because it's discriminatory, or something like that. And why is it a bad thing? Well, everybody says it's a bad thing. All right, what we have here is illusion. These are the things that may pass. We didn't always think sex discrimination was a bad thing in this country. Until the last 30, 40, 50 years, we thought it was just a Jim Dandy thing in this country. Now we've changed our mind. Now what might we think next week? And that's a pretty frightening thought. We may change all of our values, all of our ideals. They've changed in the past. The world is changing, like the river. And maybe we can't count on things being the same. And this made the Greeks unnerved. And if you think about it long enough, it's going to unnerve you considerably too. But this is the first level, opinion. And that's all we have to work with most of the time. Now we can go beyond it, Plato and Socrates tell us, to the level of reflective knowledge by asking questions, engaging in the reasoning together, engaging in the Socratic dialogue. Discrimination is a bad thing, we might argue, when it is arbitrary. When we say sex discrimination is bad, we're saying it's bad because sex is an arbitrary differentiator. A good discrimination is based, we might argue to one another, on a relevant criterion. If intelligence or if sex has something to do with the question at hand, by which we're separating people, such as college admissions or having babies or something of that kind, then we would not say it's unjust to discriminate. But it's only when it's used arbitrarily or irrelevantly to the purpose at hand. Ah, you say, that's a smart distinction. That's very interesting. But Plato would say, that's okay. It's a definition. You've reasoned to something, but it's only halfway home, because this is a formal, logical, rational definition of an idea of justice, but it is not the idea. It is not the form of justice itself. You are able to make that definition simply because you knew the form in the first place and could say this definition tends to hit the form. So what is the form? Well, the form is an immediate apprehension. It is the sudden encounter with the idea of justice itself. It is knowledge of the permanent idea of justice behind all the events, all the examples, all the instances, all the manifestations in the world. I can't show you justice. Maybe I can give you an idea of a form if you'll let me play with beauty. I can take you out of an evening on a northern lake, somewhere in the Quetico, where all is quiet. I can show you a sunset, and I don't have to tell you it's beautiful, and I can't define beauty for you. There is only one word for it, and it is G. And you have apprehended beauty in and of itself. It is not a definition, and giving a definition would be irrelevant. Now, if that will count for beauty, then Plato is saying all the definitions we give to justice are not the same as that apprehension of justice itself. Now, let's return to the idea of the philosopher king. Truth and politics. Only those who understand, Plato is telling us about at the end of the construction of the State of the Guardians, only those who perceive and know the forms should rule. Only they can lead the just state, and only they know what true justice is. See, that is reality. The reality is not the definition. The reality is not the logic. This is why our word, the philosopher king, is so bad. It's not rational. It's not a definition. It's not an axiom. It's the immediate apprehension of the forms. And so the word philosopher doesn't fit. What Plato is after is saying the person who should rule is the person who knows justice itself, not the one who's thought about it, not the one who's reasoned to a system of justice, but the one who's seen it. Well, now we can see more clearly what Plato means by the ideal ruler, but think about the ideas that we've heard so far and ask yourself, where else have you heard them? Now, think of what Plato's taught. Harmony, balance, a sense of oneness is essential to the good life and the good society. Reality is an illusion. There is a truth behind appearances and the things of this world. Enlightenment comes from understanding the wholeness, or the oneness of things. The essence of truth is inexpressible. It can't be said in words. The teachers of wisdom, those who have been to the mountain, must speak in parables, because true wisdom is direct experience. Now, if you've heard this before, you can see that these are words you hear that are religious, not rational. This is Oriental mysticism. There's a bit of Zen in here. There's a bit of Buddhism. There's all the great religious traditions of the world speak in about the same way. The truth is inexpressible. The truth is one. There's a wholeness to experience. And now we see a little dimension of Plato that is lost in that word philosopher king. For the philosopher king is not the lover of reason, or the lover of wisdom, as we might say in the modern world, but rather he begins to look more like the prophet, the Buddha, the mystic, or the Christ figure. So when Plato says philosophers are those who apprehend the eternal and the unchanging, and when Plato says there will be no end of our troubles until philosophers rule, what he's really saying is there will be no end of our troubles until mystics rule in some way. Now this takes us to the allegory of the cave, which is Plato's next and kind of culminating expression of all of this. And he sets up a picture because he too must speak in parables to make his message come across. And it's hard to tell from the text, but to express it gently, you can picture what Plato has in mind. He contrives this scene where a group of prisoners are chained by chains in a deep cave in such a way that they can only see straight ahead, and they can't move, and they can't get up, and they're just living there. They were born there, they were brought up that way, they've been there more or less forever. And it's very dark in the cave, and all at once, for reasons of their own, a group of people start showing shadow pictures of the kind, sometimes you've done that. You take a slide projector and a screen and you start making duck pictures with your fingers and things like that. Well, the sun's outside the cave and it's shining into the cave and it shines on the back wall, which is sort of like a movie screen. And all at once these prisoners, who by now are totally bored sitting there in this position, start seeing shadows flickering across the back wall of the cave, and they began talking about them. And pretty soon they begin to say, the figures begin to appear over and over again, and they begin to see this figure over and over again that has kind of long, funny ears. And they begin to say, there it goes again. Yep. Saw that at 2 o'clock yesterday. Yeah. One says, I think, why don't we, we'll see that again. That's a rabbit. Well, that's a good name for it. And the next time it comes, they say, that's a rabbit. And they keep looking at this thing, and then they begin to have this game. They begin to name all the things they see, and they say, that's a mixmaster, that's a pelican. Various things begin to appear before them, and they begin, that's an in-joke, yes. They see these things appearing before them on the screen, and they go by, and they create a whole language, but more importantly, they create a whole universe. Everything they know about the universe is what they've seen there. Now, all at once, one of the prisoners breaks his chains and walks out into the sunlight. Now, incidentally, just sort of a passing thought here. Sun worship is going to be a theme we're going to see. We saw it back in Egypt. We're going to see it again with Copernicus in the 1500s. But watch the motive force behind reality in Plato. It's the sun. It's kind of fascinating. And all at once, you look into the sun, and the one person who escapes is blinded for an instant, and he sees reality, and it's so strange, and it's so startling, and it's, the colors are vibrant, and the brightness just hurts his eyes, and he's tempted to run back into the cave. But finally, he turns around and walks out, and he begins to see things as they are, and he begins to see this little funny furry thing with long ears, and he says, hey, that's a real rabbit, and this is a real pelican over here, and that's a real mixmaster, and you've got all of these things out here. And he says, look, they're colored, and they have sharp delineations, and they're not these things, they're not as the forms are at all. And he runs back into the cave, and he tells the people, hey, you've been deluded. That's wrong. What you're seeing on the walls is just false. And the world isn't that way at all. And he tries to persuade the prisoners that what they see is not truth. And they laugh at them. And he says, look, you tell me about this furry thing that's white and wiggles its nose, and tell me that's a rabbit. That isn't a rabbit. A rabbit is that fuzzy thing that, kind of goes across the screen back there. And you tell me this thing is a mix master. That isn't a mix master. A mix master is that shape up there. You're crazy, man. It has nothing to do with reality at all, what you're talking about. Now, the person who's gone out into the light, the philosopher king, if we can, the mystic king, comes back. And he now tries to release the people and lead them out and say, look, this is crazy. He's so intent on showing them how the world really is. And they say, no, we're not going with you. But he keeps trying to force them. And finally, they kill him. Now, what's Plato's message at this point then? Only if the mystic becomes king can there be a truly just society. But if the mystic tries to rule, the people whose common sense understands only appearances, not the truth, will scorn him, defy him, and eventually put him to death. As they killed Socrates, as 400 years later they would kill Christ, as throughout history they would kill, so Plato would suggest, long before the event, everyone who understood the truth. Now, from this, what does Plato's political message become? Well, is it that the first message we got out of him, that the guardians who are educated in the craft of justice should rule? That's one message that people have taken through the centuries from Plato, that you need a specially educated class who knows the craft of politics. This is the sense in which Plato is sometimes called the father of modern totalitarianism. Or is Plato's message that the mystic, the philosopher king, the one who has been to the mountain, the Buddha, the person who truly knows justice, should rule? Perhaps that's Plato's message. Or after you get to the allegory of the cave, and that is the message you might take away. If you take the first message away, that the guardian should rule, that's the message you would take away from Plato's construction of the ideal society. The second message comes out of Plato's conception of the forms, that the philosopher king, the mystic king, the person who truly knows reality behind opinion and even behind rationality, behind reflective reason, should rule. But the third possibility appears out of the allegory of the cave, that government can never be based on true justice, on reality, on the order of the universe, and therefore politics is ultimately a tragedy, because we have the forms in our mind, an intimation of them, a suspicion of them, but we can never be satisfied with any government. And we all live in the cave, and politics will always be conducted in the cave and will never reflect reality. So one way of reading Plato, and I admit that what I've told you today is merely one man's interpretation. There are hundreds and thousands of interpretations of Plato, and you don't have to copy it all down. I'm not teaching you the truth, just one way of looking at it. Plato has taken you up the mountain and he's taken you down again. And all the questions still are there for us to examine. First, is politics a craft? That's the first metaphor he uses. Is it more than opinion or a struggle for power? Are some policies really better and juster and more desirable from the point of view of the people than others? Then, is there a higher truth than opinion or even rational definition that is vaguely reflected in our moral sensitivities? Has Plato persuaded you that there are, in some way, absolutes of right and wrong that exist in the mind? And the third question is, can true justice be realized in the world? Or given that humankind is condemned to live in darkness, is the philosopher king an impossibility? And if the third is the case, how then do we understand the problem of government and the economy and human affairs if it can't be based on reality, if it can't be based on science, if it can't be based on an understanding of the nature of the universe and human beings? Now that's the question, the ultimate question, I guess, in some ways, that Plato leaves you with. and we'll examine that one next time. As I suggested for the last week, for our last two lectures, we've been talking about Plato's Republic and going through it section by section, condensing this most remarkable argument that in the end leaves you with more questions than you began, because we're not quite sure at the end, nor has Western civilization been quite sure of what to make of Plato. There seem to be three very different political messages here, three very different teachings about ethics and about the world, about government and economics. It all depends on whether we focus on what sometimes is called Plato's utopia, that highly structured, just and harmonious state based on a division of labor, which is ruled by a guardian class. Now that's the state that most have seen and talked about over the years. Or whether we focus instead on Plato's ideal of the philosopher king, or whether we focus on the significance of the allegory at the cave. There are three very different political messages here. And in a way, we can say that Plato's significance for our times, for all times, depends on which of those we focus on and take most seriously. But today, let's just discuss first, generally, what Plato's philosophy has meant to Western thought and how his ideas of politics may have relevance for our times or have been thought to have had relevance in our thoughts about politics and economics and social thought through the ages. Some, after all, have argued that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato or an argument with him, that somehow Plato started the conversation of Western civilization. And well into next semester, when we begin to study Marx and we begin to study Hegel and even the American pragmatists, we'll still see that these thinkers, philosophers of, if not quite our age, then the age just before ours, were still trying to answer the questions that Plato put. And you can still see the Platonic questions through contemporary newspapers and magazines and learned journals and articles. These things come back to haunt us all the time. But the interesting thing is that Plato's ideas have never been dominant in Western civilization. There's never been a Platonic age, really, as there's been an age of science or an age of Christianity or even an age of Aristotle, one might say. He's always been behind the scenes. He's always cut against the current of the thought of all time. Plato has never been common sense. People have never in Western civilization thought generally and naturally like him. And I suppose that's why he's been so exciting to read all through the centuries, is that Plato always gets us or asks us to think differently about things, to challenge our common sense and to question it. And he remains an undercurrent then in our thinking that reemerges from time to time with often revolutionary and remarkable implications and significance. I suppose the central theme and the really radical nature of Plato's thought lies in what we might call his idealism. Now, that's a technical philosophic term, and it doesn't mean that he was idealistic and believing in good things, but idealism, as philosophers use the term, really means the central Platonic idea that ideals are real, that they actually exist, that they're not just figments of our imagination. And behind Plato's idealism is even the stronger thought that abstract ideas like beauty or goodness or justice are in a funny way more real than the commonplace things of this world, things like tables and chairs and corn and clouds and airplanes. Now, this really revolutionizes our common sense way of thinking about things, because I think in our natural approach to the world, we think of ideas as dream stuff, as figments of our imagination. They pass, they're transitory, they're fluid, they're flexible. They don't seem very real. And we attach the word reality or existence or sureness to the material objects of the physical universe. And in that sense, we normally think in completely the reverse terms from Plato. Well, Plato's argument was that the mind and certain ideas, the permanent ideas, the lasting ideas, the core ideas of our minds, were much more real than the things of this world. And that was his answer to the pre-Socratic question. In a world of contingency and flux, what is everlasting? What can we count on? And what is changing? And his answer is, well, the things of this world could be quite different. And furthermore, so could a lot of our ideas be quite different. And we know that what he called opinion, or doxa, changes all the time. It changes from one thing into another. This year, we believe that America is doing beautifully and that our ideals are grand and that America's in a very patriotic mood. Everything we do is right. 15 years ago, we believed that everything America did was wrong, that our ideals were wrong. These moods come and go. Our ideas change. But Plato argued, at a deeper level, the most permanent and enduring thing in the world are our ideas, the ideas that he associated with the forms, the basic ideas that make it possible for us to communicate, that make it possible for us to understand. For us to identify anything in the world, we have to have an idea of it. And our ideas, our most abstract ideas, in fact, words like justice, beauty, goodness, are the most permanent and unchanging things in the world, or at least the idea behind the idea, the part of the mind that makes it possible for us to think such thoughts at all. Well, from that idea then, from that point of view, from Plato's point of view then, we live in a world of illusion. We live in a world of changing and transforming appearances. But only when we begin to reflect, introspect, when we walk up the mountain with the philosopher and reach the world of the forms, do we begin to understand what reality really is. And in that ancient search of Western man to make human life correspond to the order of the universe. So Plato sees this very radically in the idea that human life should correspond to these forms, these ideas in the back of the mind that make the world unchanging and what it is. Now, this idea of idealism has been long debated in Western civilization. It's probably divided philosophy more than anything else between idealists, you might say, who are also incidentally called realists, though we use the term backwards for realism. But between the idea that the most important thing in the world were physical experiences, sensations, and that our ideas of them were only illusions of the real world or images of the real world. And on the other hand, the idea that the things of the real world were only images of our ideas. That question has been debated over and over and over again. But philosophy is a distant thing from our civilization. Ours is an age of science, and we live every day in a world of science. And the truly remarkable thing is that Plato's ideas, in a very strange way, have informed all of the idea behind all of Western scientific imagination. First is the thought that the meaning or the logic of the universe is a reflection of basically mathematical forms. Now, that's the Pythagorean element underlying Plato's thought. And to be sure, much of modern science has gone directly back to Pythagoras. But as we'll see some time later on in the Great Copernican Revolution, which sets so many of our ideas about astronomy and physics, this theme was passed on from Plato. And it was people who were Platonists, underground Platonists, who really established much of the framework of modern science. And their view was that the world had to make sense mathematically. So that mathematics, that until you had a mathematical explanation of something, you really didn't have an explanation of it all. Until you could create equations that would talk about the physical properties of matter, you really didn't understand matter, or in economics, or in any other field of science. Now, we take that much for granted, and all of you have somehow dutifully learned that to learn physics or learn chemistry, well, less in chemistry, but to learn physics or many hard sciences, you need a mathematical base. You have to take calculus. You have to take advanced mathematics. But you've never really asked yourself why. And the answer is that scientists presume that reality is mathematical, ultimately. And in that sense, modern science looks terribly, terribly Platonic. And it's a huge assumption that underlies all of modern science. And I suppose what's terribly spooky about it is that to the extent that modern science works, to the extent that we can create atom bombs and understand the mysteries of matter and nature, Plato might have been right. His hunch was in some sense confirmed by modern science. Reality is mathematical, at least as it is understood by modern science. So this very strange Greek philosopher who you've been looking at and thinking, my, what an odd man was he, what peculiar thoughts, thinks thoughts that have been enforced upon you by the entire scientific world, and that to the extent that you believe in science, which is also a matter of faith, of course, are confirmed by modern science. Now that's one thing. The second thought is even deeper about the impact of Platonic reasoning on modern science, and it works like this. To believe in science at all, you have to believe that the world is rational, the universe is rational, which means that the order of nature is like the order of human reason. Now, you just ponder that one a moment, because it's not a terribly easy thought the first time you hear it. But there's a strange article of faith underlying all science, which is that the way the human mind understands things is in fact the way the universe is. Now that's an audacious thing to say when you think of it, that man can understand the universe because the reason of the universe is like human reason. The Judeo-Christian tradition, by the way, has been very suspicious of this belief, because in a way it makes man God. Man's reason is like God's reason. And if man can be the perfect knower, if the universe is exactly a reflection of human reason, then in fact, or that human reason is just like the reason of the universe, then in fact man in a way can become God. And as we'll see when we get into the long Christian tradition, the question of how much human reason could know the will of God, which is the same thing in religious terms as the order of nature, has been a very open question for a very long time. But this is the faith behind all of modern science, was that human reason could understand the true nature of the universe, which means that however the universe was created, it works along principles that are open to human reason. And the more you think about that, that's a gigantic article of faith too. But all scientists have believed that to one extent or another. Copernicus believed that, Newton believed it, Galileo believed it. Albert Einstein, the father of theory of relativity, believed it. In his great debate with Heisenberg on the uncertainty principle, Heisenberg proclaimed that scientific knowledge could not know truth exactly. Because truth was essentially the study of random events, and the universe was full of random events. And that all that science could be was probabilistic. It could kind of look at things and study the forces behind them and the causes behind them, and it might be able to make some statements about what was likely to occur based on statistical probabilities. Einstein examined this assertion and rejected it. And his ground was an interesting one. He said, God does not play craps with the universe. The universe is not a crap game. It is not meaningless to Einstein. It is not just random motion. It is not purposeless. It reflects the mind of a creator. God does not play craps with the universe. The mind of a creator whose reason is like man's. So in a religious sense, man is figuring out God's mind, God's will, by his study of creation. Well, that belief had informed Christian science through many centuries, as it informed Jewish science through many centuries. But it's also there in Plato with his funny view, his view that somehow the mind was capable of seizing on, apprehending absolute reality the reality behind appearances, that the mind then of man was the mind of the universe in a strictly and in a very hard and immediate sense. So Plato's idealism looks very radical the first time we think about it. Then we realize that it lies behind the most common part of our civilization's faith in science as the way of explaining matter and the facts of life about the universe. But perhaps even harder to accept for our modern age is Plato's idealism in the realm of ethics and values, politics, economics, and society. Because if you take Plato seriously, what he's saying is that there are absolute values. There is right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust. And these things are not just matters of opinion, and they are not just matters of culture, and they are not just matters of convenience. They exist as surely as anything exists. Now, Plato's method of demonstrating this we've become familiar with in the past week or two. And it's an indirect way. Plato never shows you the form of justice, and he never shows you the form of beauty or truth. What he argues is as follows, is that we do, in fact, judge the norms of our society as just and unjust. That's the meaning of his dialogues with Cephalus and Polymachus and Thrasymachus, is that we are capable of stepping back from our culture and making judgments on the very values of our culture itself. Now, nobody who is completely culturally determined could do that. So that the idea of justice isn't just a cultural phenomenon, it has to lie behind it. His second point is we can criticize our own ideas of justice, of goodness, of badness, of evil, of right and wrong. And we never can really state them in logical propositions that we feel totally happy with. We always feel that something's missing. So then the question becomes, well, what are we comparing our definitions, even our very best definitions of evil or good, of beauty or justice with? And the answer he keeps giving is there must be something that we refer to that is intuitive, not totally rational, even though we can make approximations of it through reason, when we say things of that order. When we say, well, that definition of justice isn't complete. When we say that keeping promises is not always just or good. When we say that not discriminating against people may not always be just, or treating people equally may not always be just, because sometimes you do want to discriminate on relevant grounds. You want to make differences between people. Giving all people an equal education, meaning exactly an identical education, might be a very unjust thing to do because people are different. Well, I've given you a reason, I've given you an argument, I've given you the rationale for it, and you agree, but you aren't just agreeing with my logic. You're saying, yes, that fits. Somehow that seems right, according to some intuition of justice. So the method that Plato takes you through in trying to demonstrate that these ideals exist is not one of simply showing it to you, as someone might point to a tree and say, that's a tree, or that's a chestnut, or that's an oak. His method is more like that of the astronomer, who infers the existence of an invisible star from radio waves, the speed of light, and other known factors known to astronomers. And when the astronomer does this, he can't show you the star, but he says, if you accept all of these propositions about the speed of light, about the propagation of light, about radio waves, and this, and the spectrum of colors and things, then on this basis, we infer logically that a star must be there. Now, Plato, in trying to demonstrate the reality of the forms, is following exactly the same logic. He is inferring that the forms must be there by the very operation of your mind as revealed through the Socratic dialogue. Well, let's turn a little to the political implications of Plato, then, and his legacy in Western political thought. And that is equally as perplexing as his impact on our everyday assumptions about science and things. Because, as we said at the beginning, there are 3 political teachings in this book, and they're all different. They all follow from this idea of reality. And it depends on which one we concentrate on. Whether we concentrate, as most people have done, on the utopia, on government by what we call the philosopher king, but as we said last time, really is the mystic king or the prophetic king, the person who apprehends truth really and truly. Or if we concentrate on the allegory of the cave and its idea that the mystic king, the philosopher king, could never rule. Now, if we start with the first one, which so many people have concentrated on, which is Plato's Utopia, the State of the Guardians, we often think of Plato as the father of modern totalitarianism. And many contemporary philosophers have seen a straight line from Plato to Hitler, from Plato to Stalin. And they said, here is the person who argued most forcefully against democracy, human rights, individualism, all the things that the Anglo-American tradition stands for in the history of the West. Because look at that State of the Guardians. You've got a ruling class. Everybody's in their place. Everything is assigned. It is stable. It is fixed, without change, without creativity, without the kind of flux and force that we associate with an open society. Plato then is the enemy of the open society. And the way he tries to persuade you of this is to suggest that government is a craft, that government depends on expert knowledge, on knowledge of how the world actually works. Now, as we said, Plato's guardians do not know truth exactly. But what they do know are the intimations of truth, the approximations of truth. They have sort of a scientific understanding of justice based on all the kinds of justice that occur in the various activities of the world, in art and music, in the various crafts, and so on. Now, the argument can be made that this kind of a justification of government, that politics is like a craft, that those who know the true function of government should rule, is exactly what leads to modern totalitarianism. That democracy rests on skepticism. It rests on the belief that no person, no individual, knows the ultimate purpose and destiny of humankind. That no person knows perfectly what the state is for or society is for. And therefore, each person should have an equal right to participate in political activity. Now, that belief in human fallibility, that belief that none of us knows for sure, goes very, very deep in the democratic creed. And we'll see this as we go through the semester, how very deep that skepticism is. But if you reverse that presumption, and you say those who know the true meaning of government should rule, then you've got a different theory of legitimacy. And it's the theory that those who know scientifically how to govern should rule. Well, Plato put it one way. Those who govern those who have the knowledge to rule are those who know the forms, the ideals. But modern philosophies have sometimes put it differently. For example, in the contemporary Soviet Union, it is argued that those who know the laws of historical, political, economic development are the ones who legitimately rule. And they are those who know Marx and Lenin's critique of capitalism and to understand the process of historical development by which a society transforms itself from capitalism to socialism and then finally into a state of communism. And this isn't just a matter of some ideal from the Marxist point of view. This is a matter of science. Marx is a scientist. Marx is viewed as having a scientific understanding of society. An amazing thing, about 5 years ago, the International Political Science Association, for reasons known only to the International Political Science Association, decided to hold its meetings in Moscow. It was a lovely occasion, as you can imagine. And our colleagues in the Soviet Union wrote us this marvelous letter inviting their American colleagues to attend the meeting. And it began, that through Marx and Lenin, we understand the true laws of historical development, we can collaborate in building a truly scientific science of politics. Well, it was a charming thought, and its naivete was wonderful, but it actually was delivered in that form. And if you read Soviet textbooks today on the foundations of Marxism-Leninism, you justify rule by one party on the ground that those people know the craft of politics. Now, Hitler claimed something of the same thing through his racial theories of politics, as did Mussolini. And in this sense, one argues that if you accept that analogy of politics as being like a craft, you may be led to totalitarianism. Well, all right. But now let's kind of back off from that argument again. Because within our own society, we've said much the same way, and we do think and we do say the same thing to one another. And we do accept that some aspects of politics are craft-like at least, even if you can't exactly say where you want to draw the line. But we do argue that city planning, for example, is not the sort of job that everybody can do, and that decisions on city planning ought to be left up to people who are specialists in the trade. And we do argue that economic policy decisions ought to, if not be made by, at least be influenced by the knowledge of political economists or economists. And we do say that many of the tasks of modern society are too complex to be handled by any citizen or even by politicians. Our society has become a government by experts. Our congressional committees are staffed by political scientists and economists and all manner of social scientists and experts in various policy areas, as are our government bureaucracies. And so, in a sense, we do endorse, at least in part, the Platonic vision that truth should speak to power, at least part of the time, though we've never been able to draw exactly the line at which science and knowledge and the craft-like parts of politics should be reconciled to democracy. And before dismissing Plato's views on the guardians altogether, I suppose one should consider not just the government of the state, but a government like the government of a corporation, because a corporation is a polity too. And if you look at an organization the size of IBM or General Motors, you begin to see that we do think about the government of the corporation almost as Plato described it. For example, we would say that a corporation needs accountants, and it needs salesmen, and it needs engineers, and it needs machinists, and it needs painters, and it needs tool makers. And it is better if people specialized in these tasks than if somebody did sales work today and was on the assembly line tomorrow, and the third day was doing the accounting, and the fourth day was in charge of investment and things of that kind. It also, though, we say, needs managers. And managers do not have any one of these particular skills. In the modern school of business, a manager is a manager. We train people to be managers. And we teach what is essentially, well, what Chester Barnard, one of the fathers of modern administrative science, called the art of coordination, which is about the same thing as Plato meant by decay or harmony of these various functions. So that the job of the manager is not necessarily to do any one particular thing, but to lead the whole corporation through all of its functionally specific parts to its goal of making a good product profitably, employing its people, maintaining itself, and growing over time. But the goal is not simply that of the product or the books, making the books balance, or having the product sold. The goal is that all of these things should be integrated together in a total harmonious product, so that the society won't work. The corporation won't work if you just have salesmen. The corporation won't work if you just have advertising managers. It won't work if you just have people building the product and not selling it. You need to have all of those things put together, and modern management science is in charge of talking about that. And in fact, if any one of those elements rules, the corporation becomes adikia, unjust. See, the auto industry's tried that through many incarnations. And it's always found that when it promoted its executives from, made a great deal of difference in the philosophy of the American automobile. In the first generation, the generation of Henry Ford and others, engineers and designers tended to rise to the top. And you got good cars, but they often weren't very fashionable. Henry Ford's Model T and Model A, they were engineers' cars, but they weren't very classy things. After the Second World War, there was a revolution in the power elite of the auto industry, and designers and marketeers, people like Lee Iacocca, came to power. And they designed flashy cars and very marketable cars. They were the marketing men. And the American automobile became kind of beautiful and sleek, but its quality went down. It became fashionable, bigger, but the Japanese overtook us in basic engineering, product design, and production, and so forth. In a third generation, in the 1970s, the control of the corporations passed to the accountants and the financial managers. And then production was ignored almost altogether in the interests of corporate accounting, corporate profitability. And only now are the corporations finding that they need generalists on top, leaders on top, who can harmonize these various functions. But if any one of the groups within the corporation expressed their particular virtue as the virtue of the whole corporation, production, marketing, or cost accounting, the corporation would fail. Now, that's good modern business economics. You can hear that in Business Week. You can read about that in Fortune magazine. It all has to do with the reindustrialization of America and competing with the Japanese and learning the lessons of Japanese management. And if you think about it, it very much resembles Plato's philosophy of what good government is all about. Now, it's interesting, when you judged the government of the Guardians, the state of the Guardians, you judged it pretty much on, one of the things you said about it is, well, it's wrong because it isn't democratic. And that's a fascinating observation to make. Because what you were saying was, it doesn't conform to my values, to America. It isn't the American way. Therefore, it can't be good. Now, notice what you were saying, because it's a fascinating thing. Why is Plato's government wrong? Because it's undemocratic. Why is democracy then a good thing? Well, because it's our way of life. Now, Plato would have said, you weren't judging that against a standard of justice. You weren't judging that against a standard of good government. You were simply judging whether Plato's republic was compatible with your own beliefs. So what you were essentially doing was saying, I will accept or reject any political philosophy depending on whether it reinforces my beliefs or not. Just like Polymachus, just like Thrasymachus, just like those who start with the customs of their country and judge every philosophy against it. Welcome to the cave, friends, because that's exactly what you were doing in all of that. Now, think about that seriously, because what Plato's challenging you to do is very, very serious. He's asking you, why is democracy a good thing? And how do you judge democracy? Not just, it isn't good because it isn't democratic. And you will be waiting for me to teach you the theory behind democracy. And you'd better hope beyond hope that it's a good one. Because if it isn't, you're in sad trouble. Because basically, you don't want to be alienated. You don't want to reject your society or your way of life. And what you're saying is, to be part of your society is more important than truth itself at that point. Well, that's okay, and don't get too restless about it, because I personally intend to teach you that democracy is philosophically justifiable, and that will make you feel a whole lot better about it. But what if it weren't? Would truth be more important than your own society? Now, that's the question that I suppose Plato is asking you to ask. By what standard do we judge our culture itself? We can't do it the other way around and judge philosophy by the standards of our society. That's ridiculous. So we keep looking for that standard, and he proposes it. And in the end, of course, Plato does go on to tell us that the state of the Guardians would not itself be a just state. The Guardians do not really know justice. They only know how to harmonize diverse excellences. They have learned the concept of justice in its various earthly and cultural manifestations. And so then Plato goes on to say that only if philosophers, as he puts it, or as the translators put it, become kings, would we have an ideal state. Only someone who knew justice truly, who apprehended the form immediately by which we compare all conceptions and definitions of justice. Well, all right. Now notice what Plato isn't saying. He's not saying that he is the philosopher king, and he isn't saying that Socrates is. He doesn't even intimate that that would be a possibility. But he leaves us with another image: government by the prophet, government by those who know the will of God, if you want to put it in religious terms, or who know science perfectly. Now, this image of politics has also come on down to us in many forms. And of course, the difficulty with it is that in our democratic imagination, we say, well, we'd certainly be willing to follow the will of somebody who knew the will of God truly, or who knew the nature of reality or the Platonic forms personally perfectly, as long as they could show it to us. See, this is a democratic skepticism. If you can persuade me rationally of something, I'll accept it. So if you know the will of God, prove it to me. That's the scientific way, by the way. Never accept an argument on faith. And what Plato is saying, sort of tongue-in-cheek, is, that can't be done, friend. Until you've gone to the mountain too, you don't know. So the philosopher king can't prove it to you. He will show you. He will try to teach you. He will teach in allegories. But in the end, you will reject him. Not for the reasons of the allegory of the cave, that you're too dumb to know any better, but because your whole scientific imagination says you will not believe anything until it is proven to you, and that can't be done. We're talking about a realm that transcends reason. You can go up to the mountain, and you may share the religious vision, but it's not a safe ground for society. Well then, what Plato goes on to say, almost tongue-in-cheek, is the rule of the philosopher king is an impossibility. First, he doesn't even indicate that any human mortal can get there, can be the true philosopher. It's a postulate. It's an ideal. If there were a person who knew justice truly, then they would be the ideal ruler, because they could create the society that would be a perfect manifestation of what justice truly was. But that's a logical proposition. But his second ground is that, for the idea that the philosopher king is an impossibility, is that the people would reject it. They would not recognize the truth. They would laugh. They would prefer given opinion. They would require rational credentials. And in all this way, they would not respect the philosopher king. They would laugh at him. They would disown him. Finally, they would kill him. Now, what are the political implications if we focus on this last aspect of Plato? The Plato of the allegory of the cave, Plato who says that the philosopher king is an impossibility. And in this way, we may have another Plato who does come down to us and is also part of our heritage, but a very different one. It's interesting that Plato wrote, after the Republic, 2 additional books on politics. One was called The Statesman, and the other was called The Laws. And many have argued that these are inconsistent with the Republic, that perhaps Plato became more mellow in those later years, less opposed to Athenian democracy. Perhaps he was disillusioned. But in these later books, Plato argues neither for rule by experts nor the philosopher king. And in the Laws in particular, he argues for what he would call a second-best society. If the rule of the philosopher king is an impossibility, then where can we go to for relative permanence, for relative stability in the world? And his view is that the second-best society would be one that would be founded not on rule by the guardians or by the enlightened one, but on rule of law. Now, to understand why the rule of law becomes important at this point, remember the distinction between the 3 levels of knowledge. There's pure opinion, doxa, what everybody thinks. Then there's knowledge of truth, the forms. And then there's reflective rationality, which is not only somewhere in between, but which is an approximation to the truth. And the way we do this is to reason to relatively consistent principles, which we would uphold time after time. To put it another way, the purpose of a government of laws is to reduce arbitrariness, whimsicality, randomness in human affairs. Government by opinion can be anything. It is really transient and it is in flux. It has no permanence. It has no stability. If a ruler can get up and say, if a ruler can get up and invade a country, and you asked him why he decided to do it, and he said, well, it was Thursday morning, and it seemed like a good day for an invasion. That's government by tyranny. Or if a judge decides for a defendant on the ground that the prosecution had shifty eyes, you just blink. I mean, this is irrationality. This is a world of Franz Kafka, a world where nothing makes sense. The rule of law requires that we base our judgments on consistent principles that become then a kind of ideal, a kind of reality that gives society form and shape and order over time. So, for example, in our liberal democracy, we start from the proposition, roughly, that all social arrangements should be seen to rest on or to enhance the free choices of individuals equally considered. And then we reason from that to the implications of it. We ask, well, if that is the case, that society should be based on the free choices of individuals equally considered, can we tolerate having a different standard or different status for blacks and whites? Can we have discrimination on grounds of race, on an irrelevant differentiator between people that has nothing to do with their function or their performance in society? And then if we establish that principle for race, can we disregard it for sex? Or can we disregard it for some other accidental characteristic? And as we reason through this, we come toward a standard that informs us and gives society understandability, coherence, and a certain order of predictability. Well, if this is the political message of Plato, then he is the ancestor not of totalitarianism or of theocracy ruled by the gods, but of constitutional democracy. And in that sense, Plato becomes the ancestor not of the Soviet Union or of modern totalitarianism, but of the Anglo-American tradition of the common law, of systems in which the laws bind the ruler as well as the rule. And such a state is possible because the people can rise above mere images on the basis of reflective reason and moral instinct, on the basis of their innate sense of justice, and work it out through questions of consistency and consistency with principle.